Hi, this is Jeff. Welcome to my video on the International Poppy Project worked in Clonus lace. This is a narrated version of a slideshow that I posted in 2011. Basically in 2011, I finished the project and immediately sent it off to Susie Johnson for a tour around the world. And so it's back in my possession, and I thought I'd use the opportunity to make an updated narrated version. An overview of the things that I'll talk about, I'll tell you a little bit about the lace maker, so that's me, and then the commission, how did I come to be invited to make a lace project, and then the International Poppy Project itself, I'll tell you a little bit more about how the idea came to be, and then some guidelines around the project, and then the proper motivation. What was it that we were hoping to achieve in making this Poppy Project in Clonus lace? A compelling narrative is the story that I came up with to help me make design decisions. Sometimes when you're starting a piece and you don't quite know where to go, if you come up with an inspiration or a story, that helps you make your decisions. And then key elements of Irish crochet lace. I want to talk about what are the key characteristics of Clonus lace, how do we recognize that, what are its distinctive features. And then the design and working process, I'll tell you a little bit about the design decisions that I made and how I made them, and also some technical things that I needed to develop in order to get the shapes that I wanted. And then mounting and framing. After I finished the project, I basically sewed it onto a piece of poster board that was covered with some fabric, and then had it mounted in a shadow box type frame. And then finally, exhibition. After I finished it, I sent it to the International Organization of Lace for some exhibitions around the world, so in France, in Belgium, and back in the United States. So some information about me, the lace maker. I learned how to crochet by being taught by my mother, probably around when I was 5. She really taught me, my brother, my sister how to crochet. And in the beginning, we all learned how to crochet with yarn. And then probably when I was in my 20s, I started crocheting with thread. And then in 2005, I had a very eye-opening experience at Lacis in Berkeley when they hosted an exhibit on Irish crochet lace. And so that's when I sent away for a book by Mayra called Clonus Lace and learned more about Irish crochet lace. And then afterwards, I attended one of the workshops that Mayra was teaching at Lacis in Berkeley. And so then I went back in 2010, 2011, and then 2012. So let me talk a little bit about how I was invited to make this Poppy project in Clonus lace. So in 2011, I was at the Lacis Museum of Lace and Textiles for one of Mayra's workshops, and my friend Patty, who's from Alaska, was there. And Patty was talking about introducing Irish crochet lace to the International Organization of Lace, which was called International Old Lacers at the time. So at the time, IOLI was much more focused on needle lace and bobbin lace. So in lace and textiles, the laces that are considered true laces are made with either a needle and thread, so techniques of sewing, that's called needle lace, or made with techniques of weaving. So you take threads, you connect them to a bobbin, and then you weave them, and so that's called bobbin lace. So Patty was interested in introducing crochet lace, and one of the ways that she was thinking of doing this was to create what's called a proficiency journal. So a proficiency journal is basically a set of projects that people can make to demonstrate proficiency in a particular kind of lace. And so I thought that was a great idea, introduce Irish crochet lace, beautiful lace. And so Patty went on to say that there was a project called the International Poppy Project, and this was something that was being developed in the International Organization of Lace. And so she asked me, are you interested in making one? And that would be a great way to introduce people to Irish crochet lace. And so I thought, that's a great idea. And Patty, probably at the time, thought, he doesn't know what he's getting into. This was probably before I had my iPhone, and so it was not possible for me to look up exactly what this is. And so later, when I learned about this, there were many examples of the Poppy projects that other lace makers had created. And really, one of the first things that you realize is that these lace makers are not messing around. Like, this was serious, dedicated, beautiful, detailed projects. And so you can see some examples of the International Poppy Project here worked in different kinds of lace. And so let me tell you a little bit about the project itself. So it began with Ulrike Völker and other women who were at the IOLI conference in Rockford, Illinois. And the idea was that lace makers would all work the same design using their own style of lace, and then by doing so, that would highlight the differences in those styles. And so the pattern that was chosen was going to be the California poppy, insofar as the next conference of IOLI was going to be held in Los Angeles, California. And so Ulrike Völker designed an Art Nouveau drawing, stylized California poppy, and so that was going to be the design that all of the lace makers used. The designs would be then framed in a frame of uniform size, 11 by 15, and then the color, the thread size, what the frame looked like, the backing, matting, those would all be up to the lace maker. The lace makers could add any elements they wanted, nothing could be subtracted. And so again, there was this idea of keeping the design as uniform as possible and thereby highlighting differences in the lace styles. And then there would be a paragraph that discussed the lace maker's process, and that would be included in the exhibition. And then all of the pieces would be displayed at the IOLI conventions and then also other appropriate venues, so other lace conferences or other events around the world. Here's a picture of the design that Ulrike drew. So it's a stylized California poppy. So that's in the middle. There's a flower at the top and the bottom, and then there's some decorative bands at the top and the bottom. So this is about the size 8.5x11 sheet of paper. Let me talk a little bit about the motivation for making this. The idea was that if we could make an international poppy project in Clones lace, people would think about it, be inspired by it, and then want to carry on this tradition. So Clones is a town in the north part of Ireland. It's in County Monaghan, and it was a center of lace making during the Great Famine. So this is an example you can see in the picture here of a jabot that was owned by Ethna Darcy of Rosslea, and that's now in the collection of Mayra Trainer. This is actually made of linen thread, and Mayra knows that I love this piece. So what is Clones lace? Clones lace is a form of Irish crochet lace. It was developed during the Great Famine, so with the collapse of agriculture as a source of income, alternative sources of income were needed, and so lace making was introduced as a means of famine relief. The production of Clones lace was centered around Clones. As I said, there were other centers of lace making as well. This style of lace in Clones was promoted by Cassandra Hand, who is the wife of the Church of Ireland minister. And then the early forms of Clones lace were based on needle lace. And then later on, when this became more established, more distinctive styles emerged. And so let me talk about some of the characteristics of Clones lace. So what is Clones lace? How can we identify it as Clones lace? So lace in general is an open work textile, and then Clones lace is made of cotton or linen thread. It is worked with a crochet hook, and then the thread is white or ecru. And so here's a picture, and again, it's taken from the Lacis Museum of Lace and Textiles archive. The style or the composition, typically all over composition with organic, naturalistic design. So this is more like Jackson Pollock appearing rather than like portraiture. So kind of all over design. Sometimes you'll see lace that has like a focal point. Clones lace tends to be much more diffuse overall composition. And then the individual motifs tend to be, like many other kinds of lace, botanical motifs. So we can see leaves, grapes, flowers, different kinds of plants are the typical motifs in Clones lace. And then the motifs are surrounded by a ground or filling stitch that connects the motifs. They're worked as a network, and then the network has little loops called picots, or clonus knots, which are these kind of looped knots that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a bit. Clones lace also includes padded rings. So in needle lace, you would take a needle and thread, and then you would sew buttonhole stitches around groups of thread. in clonus lace or crochet lace, you take a crochet hook and then you crochet around bundles of thread called a packing cord, and it gives you an effect that's a little bit analogous to that needle lace repeated buttonhole stitch look. And so those are padded rings, and then on the right here you can see I have a shamrock with a very tall padded ring there to kind of illustrate the point. And then clonus lace also has a scalloped edge, like other kinds of lace, around the border. Clonus lace often includes these richly dimensional, three-dimensional flowers, and oftentimes they are edged by crocheting over the packing cord. So again, that's using your crochet hook, taking the thread and crocheting over a bundle of threads, and so it creates this richly dimensional work. So for example, like bobbin lace would be very flat based on weaving. Clonus lace used crochet, made shapes, and so then it has this like nice, rich, that raised, like high relief kind of surface. And then the motifs, also very characteristic, are shamrocks and the wild rose. And so plants that are native to Ireland. So some of the botanical motifs tend to be shamrocks and roses. And then around the edge, so just inside of that, just from the inside of that scalloped edge, is going to be a pillar row. And so a row with these vertical stitches that defines the outer edge. So that's the pillar row. And then very characteristic of clonus lace is the presence of clonus knots in the filling stitch. So I have the definition here. Clonus knot is a round raised knot made by twisting the thread around the crochet hook multiple times. And so you end up with this ball shape, and then if you group them together, you can form a shamrock clonus knots. And so that would be a knot with 3 of these clonus knots together. Let me tell you a little bit about how the lace is constructed. And so what happens is that the individual motifs are worked separately. So you make all of the motifs and then you sew them or pin them onto a piece of cloth or fabric. And then after you have them sewn down, then you work the filling stitch to connect all of them. And then you make a pillar row that helps to define the edge. And then finally, there's a scalloped edge around the outside. When you finish your work, then you snip off all of your basting stitches, disconnect it from the paper or the fabric, wash it, press it, and that is your piece of lace. So the motivation for making the project. What is clonus lace? Clonus lace, this is a beautiful form of Irish crochet lace that helped relieve suffering of families during the Great Famine in Ireland. And so if people understood the history of this lace, appreciated the beauty of this lace, people would be inspired to learn more about this and then carry on this form of lace making. This idea of the compelling narrative, when I started the project, you look at this Art Nouveau drawing and, your mind goes in different directions and there's lots of directions it could go. So I felt like I needed a story or an inspiration to help me figure out how was I going to make those design decisions. And so the story that I came up with is that there was a wealthy advertising executive who married an American woman with Irish heritage. Together, they lived in San Francisco in around kind of the mid-1800s when clonus lace was very popular. Her ancestry traced back to Rosslea in County Fermanagh, which is near Clonus. The advertising executive decided that for his wife's birthday, he wanted to commission a piece of clonus lace to honor her Irish heritage. He asked one of the draftsmen in his advertising agency to make a drawing that kind of illustrated this, something that would represent California. The draftsman produced a piece that represented California with the California poppy. That drawing was then given to a textile importer who then gave it to a lace dealer in Dublin, and then the lace dealer in Dublin knew exactly who could fulfill this kind of commission. And so he gave the drawing to Mrs. Cassandra Hand and said, a wealthy client in North America would like a piece of clonus lace commissioned for his wife's birthday. Can you fulfill this commission? So this is the story that I came up with. I imagined that Cassandra Hand received a commission to create a piece of clonus lace as a birthday present for a client in San Francisco. So when she got this commission, she thought, this work represents a commission from a wealthy client in San Francisco. It will change hands many times. Each person who sees it could become another customer. We must create a piece that fulfills the commission and displays the beauty of our Clonus lace. The income from this work will benefit the women of Clonus. So that helped me make the design decisions. It had to fit into the International Poppy Project, and so that meant that it had to include all of the design elements and follow the diagram of the California poppy. It also had to represent Clonus lace, and so it had to contain all of these key elements like the three-dimensional shapes, the filling stitch, Clonus knots, scalloped border, shamrock, raised road motifs, and padded rings. And then finally, the motivation for it. It had to be a poppy project, it had to show Clonus lace, and it had to do it in a way that would help promote understanding about Clonus lace. Let me talk just a little bit about the design and the working process. Some of the design decisions had to do with the thread and also the crochet hook. So really those are the materials to make crochet lace. So the choices for thread had to do with using Sibylle or coordinate, and then choosing between white and ecru, and then the size of the thread. And then for the hook, I needed to choose a particular brand and then also a size. For the materials then, for the thread, I ended up choosing DMC coordinate. I chose coordinate over Sibylle because I thought that the coordinate had a kind of a crisper hand to it. Sibylle is a little bit softer. And then for the color, I chose ecru to give it kind of an antique appearance. And then the size 100 is what I chose because that's the finest thread available. So in the past, Clonus lace was made out of much finer either cotton or linen thread, and what's available today is the size 100. And in terms of the hook, the brand that I chose was Tulip, and if you've never used a Tulip hook, I strongly recommend trying it. The hook has just a deeper hook on the end, and somehow it holds the thread better, and it's much easier to crochet. And then the size, I chose a size 16, which is just under the smallest size that they have, but it's appropriate for the size 11 or size 100 thread. Here's some of the design decisions then. So the question is, if you are thinking about Clonus lace, and if Clonus lace is the style you're working in, how do you look at a design and how do you interpret the design using that style of lace? So the eye trained on Clonus lace will see three-dimensional shapes in a drawing. So if you look at all of these petals at the end, there's these aspects where it looks like it turns over. In a bobbin lace, you would probably make those all flat in your design. In Clonus lace, crochet lace, because it's characterized by three-dimensional shapes, I wanted those to pop out of the background. Looking at the stems, so when I saw it, it looked like this was an opportunity to do stitches over a packing cord. So again, that idea of sort of imitating the style of needle lace, or the technique of needle lace, of sewing buttonhole stitches over thread. Crochet lace, you would crochet single crochets or double crochet in European style. And you would crochet those over a packing cord. And then looking at the sides on these decorative bands, I thought that I could make pillar rows out of the ends. And then looking at these two flowers, this was an opportunity to use padded rings in the center of motifs. Looking at the background of course was going to be a filling stitch using Clonus knots, and probably shamrock Clonus knots as well, given that we wanted to illustrate Clonus lace. Because of the kind of all-over design, I needed to add additional motifs, and those motifs were going to be botanically based, so leaves and flowers. To connect them, to lend a little bit more coherence to it, I wanted to add this curved stem. Around the edge, Clonus lace is finished with a scalloped edge, so I wanted to add that to these bars. And thinking about the background, did I want it to be tight or open, regular or irregular? Because sometimes lace has a very regular background. For this project, I wanted an open ground so that the poppy would look very distinct in the middle. I didn't want a busy background so that you wouldn't be able to see the poppy really distinctly. And then I wanted an irregular background because Clonus lace tends to have that organic, naturalistic look about it. The idea was that the ground was going to be irregular, whereas the motifs were going to be more structured. So then then thinking about, was the composition going to be focused or an all-over composition? Because it's a California poppy project or international poppy project, the composition had to be focused on the poppy, so it really had to be a focused composition. And then I added these additional motifs because in general the style of Clonus lace is all-over composition. So it's kind of had to be a little bit of a balance, a little bit of a compromise between focused and all over. So there were additional motifs that was going to give it more of an all over feel, and then I added the stem, and so that kind of like brought it back together, a little bit more focused. Now this is obviously not a tutorial. At the same time, I wanted to mention some of the design challenges that were involved in making this. So usually shapes in Irish crochet have some kind of symmetry about them. So radial symmetry, bilateral symmetry, and in looking at the California poppy petals, they have this flare about them, and then they curve over, and so they are asymmetric, and so it's unusual to have these asymmetric patterns in Clonus lace or crochet lace. So what I ended up doing, you can look at the steps down here. So starting at the star, number 1, crochet a chain down and then single crochets back up, and then on number 2 crochet some single crochets down and then slip stitches into the single crochets, and then turn it and then do some slip stitches and then additional single crochets. And so that's how I created these kind of irregular tapered shapes. Looking at the curved stems, this again was very unusual to have stems that had to curve in a very particular defined manner. This was probably one of the most difficult steps. What I did was I single crocheted across a very thick packing cord, and then I slip stitched into the single crochets one at a time when it was straight, and then when it had to curve, I would skip single crochets and slip stitch into like every other stitch, and so that's what made it curve in this particular way. This was like, it's hard to explain, but this is one of the most difficult steps there. Another working challenge was that I wanted to make round Clonus knots. I didn't always achieve this. Sometimes Clonus knots, the way that the hook swivels around, the loops end up building up kind of in sequence on the hook, and so you end up with kind of this dinner roll type shape. It's almost like a bullion type stitch, whereas I wanted these kind of round ball-like shapes, so it was just a different way to make a Clonus knot to end up with this sesame ball type shape. The way that I did it, again, this is not a tutorial, I'll just kind of talk you a little bit through it. So 20 loops on the hook, twisting it very tightly, and then number 2, yarn over, do a slip stitch over the knot, and then 2 more chains. And then if there were any loose loops in the Clonus knot, then I would kind of slip stitch into those loops, and that would kind of like draw them in, and so then you didn't have these loose loops flying off the Clonus knot. And then single crochet into the that stitch before the Clonus knot, and then so that would create this Clonus knot with this kind of ball-like appearance. In order to make these grouped Clonus knots into the shamrock Clonus knot, this again was a little bit hard. It's a little bit hard to describe, so I'll show you the pictures. So 3 Clonus knots in a row, 2 chains between them, and then single crochet in the stitch preceding the first knot, and then you can pause it here to read the directions. Let me just go through the pictures with you. So number 1, 3 Clonus knots, 2 chains between the knots, and then number 2, put the hook in the stitch before the first knot and then do a single crochet, and so that closes the loop and brings them together. And then there's going to be another single crochet in number 3 here between knot number 3 and knot number 1, and then I actually removed the hook from the thread, reinserted the hook between 1 and 2, and pulled the loop through 2 and 1 to bring all 3 of them together. Finally, made slip stitches under it to continue the chain. So hard to describe. This is obviously not a tutorial. Another design challenge was that the design that I was trying to create used very long stitches in the filling stitch. So usually in Clonus lace, the filling stitch is much more compact, and so the number of stitches or chains in between the different intersections is really only 5 or 7. And so I wanted these very long chains. And so the solution was to use long chains up to 20 stitches and then long stitches of up to 15 overs. So if you're like doing a double crochet, you do a yarn over and then you pull through twice. This was winding the hook up to 15 times over the hook and then pulling it through each of those times to create this very, very long stitch. And then another design challenge here is that I felt like, this is probably just me now, I felt like I needed much more precision in the ground. I felt like I didn't want to just go by feel across the project, and I wanted the whole thing designed before I started. And so I imported a picture of the project, of my motifs, into Microsoft Word, and then I designed the whole thing using just the basic shape software in Microsoft Word. And so you can see the picture here, that's the template that I worked off of. So this is how I worked it. I'll just go through this sequence with you, starting with the star and then around through the bottom, over the top, and then over the side to the right, through again, and back to the start. So that was the direction of the filling stitch. Here's a picture of what it looked like when I was working it. As you can see, it was a lot of stop-start with the different parts of the filling stitch. So it definitely was not continuous filling stitch all over the entire thing. Here's another picture of what it looked like when I was working it through. Obviously it is a mess while you're working it. Here's the final product. So mounting it on a backing, as I said, I sewed it down onto kind of a piece of thick poster board that had a kind of greenish fabric, kind of linen-ish fabric on top. This is kind of a side angle. I like this picture from the angle because you can kind of see especially how thick those stems ended up. So it was single crochets over a thick packing cord, and then you can kind of see that ridge underneath the stems. That's the ridge that I did the slip stitches into in order to create the curve of the stems. So did we achieve Clonus lace? So what makes this Clonus lace? So let's go through some of the steps. It is an open work textile worked with a crochet hook and ecru thread, so that's what lace is and that's what crochet lace is. It has botanical motifs, so flowers, leaves. There are three-dimensional shapes, so the raised rose, shamrock, and then the petals on the poppy have this three-dimensional look about them. It has shamrock and raised rose motifs, so very characteristic of Irish crochet. There are crochet stitches over a packing cord, so again, very characteristic of Clonus lace. There are padded rings in the center of the motifs. The filling stitch has shamrock Clonus knots, and those connect the motifs. There is a pillar row along the perimeter. There is a scalloped edge finishing the work. So here's what it looks like, the International Poppy Project made in Clonus lace. Here's one place it went on exhibition. So it went to France for the 15th World Lace Congress. This is a picture that Susie Johnson took, and so you can see the project along with the other projects. It looks, it's interesting to see. So there's different poppy projects, and they all are made according to the same design, kind of the same frame, and you can get a sense that there's many different kinds of lace. Then it was also shown by the International Old Lacers at the conference in the Minnesota Lace Society. And this is the text that accompanied the piece. So I won't read this to you, you can kind of read it. It tells the story of how I made the design decisions and how I came up with the story of how I thought about how Mrs. Hand would have responded to a commission. Thank you very much for joining me for my video on the International Poppy Project made in Clonus lace. Please enjoy this piece of Irish history. I hope that you, like I imagine the wife of my advertising executive, also really enjoyed it. I loved making it. It's been a lot of fun to talk to people about it, so thank you for watching the video.